Hey guys, Rock Guy here doing our second album review of 2022. For a band that is as obscure as it gets, the long forgotten supergroup Medication. Medication, fantastic band, fantastic album, extremely obscure. This is the second supergroup I'm covering on this channel to feature Whitfield Crane, who, as you know, sang over the Another Animal album I'm constantly singing praises about. However, this one's a little bit more different from that album. It's just as heavy, more so in a different genre. Medication really explores a lot more sounds akin to nu metal as opposed to the post-grunge that Another Animal demonstrated. While there is a clear nu metal influence in Medication's sound, at the same time, I can't really say it sounds like any particular nu metal band except for maybe Korn at some points. It almost feels like I'm doing a disservice to the band by even boxing them into nu metal, because this album highlights a lot of musical talent, a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of concepts that nu metal never really talked about because it was too busy singing about the common tropes of the genre, such as bullying, abuse, drug addiction, so on and so forth. And that's not to say this album doesn't have any dark themes, it really does. It approaches them from a more unique perspective than bands like Papa Roach and Saliva were doing at the time. So without further ado, let's explore a very underrated album, the second supergroup, the second failed album to feature Whitfield Crane on this channel. And
I'm waiting, old man.
So let's feature the second supergroup on this channel to feature Whitfield Crane, the second most obscure album in this entire series, as I think this is even more underground than that Another Animal album. And it's equally as good. I think this is a very largely slept on album, and I'm hoping by the end of this review, you, the viewer, will get something out of it, and you could check this out wherever you could find it. So without further ado, let's get to it. So straight out of the gate, this album just comes in swinging with one of the heaviest songs on the album, the track Loaded Gun. And interestingly enough, when I was doing my research for the song, someone said Whitfield Crane was really influenced by the vocals he was performing in Life of Agony just a few years prior to this. Interestingly enough, when it comes to Whitfield Crane, I haven't really explored the stuff that's made him famous. You guys know I'm obsessed with that Another Animal album. This Medication record is something that I think is phenomenal. I'm really happy I got into it as recently as I did, while I was still able to, no less, being that this album is very rare at this point. But yeah, I haven't really listened to any of his work in Life of Agony. If I'm not mistaken, I don't even think he made studio work with those guys. And I've barely explored Ugly Kid Joe, like 3 or 4 songs here and there, but not enough for me to actually say I know what that band sounds like. Which is neat because really the stuff that established Whitfield Crane is the stuff I'm least familiar with. And the projects he's done, I guess in the eyes of commercial appeal, haven't really added a lot to his career, are the stuff I'm most familiar with, the stuff I get the most out of. I've sung enough praises for Another Animal, so I'm going to be as apprehensive as I can about talking about them in this video. But even so, what's cool about Medication is this really highlights how unique of an artist Whitfield Crane is, being that he blends into this album just as well as he does onto the Another Animal album. So going back to what I was talking about regarding Loaded Gun, it's just this really hard-hitting nu metal track that just kicks the door down, basically. Thanks in large part to the fantastic musicians surrounding this album. Logan Mader of Machine Head and Soulfly, Kyle Sanders, the bassist who would later go on to join Hell Yeah, Josh Freese, a session drummer who has played on several of my favorite records at this point, and a guy named Blunt who plays rhythm guitar. All of these guys are ridiculously talented, and all of them play their respective instrument at the highest level. That's what's so interesting about this is the second album featuring Whitfield Crane to also feature a 5-piece band. As you know, Another Animal was the same way. So like I said, Loaded Gun was an amazing kickstart to the album. It really sets the tone. Throughout the entirety of this album, there's a very sinister tone, a very dark, creepy theme that just is very prevalent throughout the entirety of the record. Musically, while I did say this is a nu metal record, it really doesn't deserve to be considered nu metal because it's so much more interesting than a lot of nu metal bands like I referenced in the intro. The closest thing I could compare this to is Korn's Untouchables, which came out the same year. I feel like if Korn didn't go back to their roots on their subsequent album, this is a pretty ideal sound they would have picked up on from Untouchables. Something new is probably my favorite song on the album. It's one of the better songs. It really makes you appreciate Whitfield Crane as a lyricist because the common theme on the entirety of this album is time and age. And you see that with something like Something New, which is most likely in reference to medication following his departure from Ugly Kid Joe and Life of Agony. Throughout the album, you really get the vibe that Whitfield Crane is basically recognizing that being a rock musician isn't yielding the rewards he thought it would. It adds a very human element to this album, being that this album came out as I departed from my first career.
Your dad lost his job.
So this was very relevant to me. It is an album I discovered after I left my first career. I got hired at a really, really shitty office job, which was hell on earth. And then I got a better job, a job that pays pretty much what I made at my career, but it's much less rewarding and much less likely to yield a prosperous future. So I was really able to immerse myself into this album. And the fact that I was able to identify with a rock singer, a musician, an established musician no less, who did find success, really goes to show how universal Whitfield Crane is as a lyricist. And I think Something New is the best example of that, where you're kind of lost in life and you're trying to figure out where you fit into the world. So you're just trying a bunch of different things and seeing which one speaks to you the most. It cannot be understated how good the musicianship is on this entire album. Logan Mader is one of the most slept on guitarists ever. Medication really makes me want to check out his work in Soulfly, as well as the stuff he did in Machine Head. I believe since this album, he's started making much heavier music in Once Human, his new band, his modern band. Kyle Sanders, after this, would go on to join Hell Yeah, which is a terrible, terrible band. But his bass work is really good here. And that's another thing I want to highlight about Prince Valium. Throughout the entirety of this album, you could really focus on each respective instrument. Like the rhythm guitar is just as identifiable as the lead guitar, as is the bass, and of course the drums, which are some of the best aspect of Prince Valium. As I understand it, the Soulfly drummer slash Stone Sour drummer was the original member of Medication. For whatever reason, he couldn't really commit to it. They were considering bringing in Shannon Larkin, who would have been amazing. God, that would have been so freaking cool if Shannon Larkin could have drummed on this, meaning that he's one of Whitfield Crane's longest collaborators and one of his best friends. And his drumming would have just been something really, really interesting on this album. But even so, I'm totally fine with Josh Freese. Josh Freese has this trait where he can basically match any style on the album he's a guest star on. And he does it very well here. I'm wondering if there was some legality issues regarding Josh Freese being on here, because on the album he's just credited as like Trey or something. And this album isn't even listed in his discography on Wikipedia. It's just glossed over for whatever reason. Even so, I think that's unfortunate because this is one of the best albums in his career. Going back to what I said earlier about Whitfield Crane's versatility, Walk Away is a great example. He leads in with this really strong vocal melody that calls back to someone like Scott Weiland. And as I'm listening to it, I'm wondering why the DeLeo brothers never hit up Whitfield Crane when they were looking for a new singer for STP. This dude is very, very versatile, and he's probably the closest thing I can imagine to someone naturally like Scott Weiland, outside of Jeff Good, of course. As I understand it, Ugly Kid Joe is basically an alternative band. They weren't grunge, they weren't hair metal, they were just kind of their own thing. He sang in Life of Agony, who I'm not familiar with. I have to imagine they sound different from Ugly Kid Joe, just based off the name of the band. And then from what I've heard in Medication, another animal on Richards Crane, like the dude just has this very universal voice to where he can blend in naturally to any setting, much like Scott Weiland was able to do so. Being that this is Whitfield Crane's like the third or fourth band in his career, it really makes me hope that he does something with the DeLeo brothers before, these guys croak, because I think they can make a lot of good music together. Especially if the DeLeos channel some of their heavier sound. Underground is a very beautiful song. It's probably the most gentle moment of the entire album. The lyrics are definitely the most touching aspect of it. This song was written about Keanu Reeves' first wife. Her name is skipping me at this moment. It's written about the tragic circumstances regarding her death. And the song itself was written by Jessica, the front woman of the band Jack Off Jill. And I think that's really cool. It kind of highlights the sense of togetherness that the rock community has, something we don't really talk about. Because this song was written for a woman, by a woman, and it was performed by a bunch of dudes who also cared about said woman. I think that's really awesome. Like the fact that they're paying homage to this woman, it reminds me of that saying, like no one's ever truly dead until they've forgotten. And in their own way, Medication is commemorating God, I really hate that I didn't learn this chick's name. So it's really cool to see Whitfield Crane, Logan, and the boys collaborating with Jessica to commemorate the life of Jennifer Syme through this song. This is one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. I would say this even has the best lyrics on the album. That's saying a lot because I love Whitfield Crane's lyrics, but Jessica really just brought something to this track that baffles me as to why it's just not more popular. It's a very human song. And that's what's interesting about Prince Valium, is as a whole, the album is very dark, but it feels very human. Like this captures a very realistic aspect of human life. Just like what I said about Something New, where I was able to immerse myself into it because of my job hopping. And Underground, where it can connect to something as tragic as premature death. I will admit, to some degree, the album is a little bit derivative. Not too much, but just a little bit. The song False Idol, for example, sounds very similar to the song Out of My Head by Puddle of Mudd. Being that Wes Scantlin and Doug from Puddle of Mudd were credited, or they were put in the acknowledgements of this album, it makes me wonder if they were kind of being ghostwriters for that. Because the riffs are very similar. And I wouldn't say it's something that's ripping off, but more so like an inadvertent ghostwriter influence. Xanax in particular addresses that theme I mentioned earlier about time passing by, getting older, losing your youth, and kind of reaching that urgency where you need to find out where your place is in the world. Super Pop is actually an interesting song because it subverts everything I just said about the album being slightly derivative, because it's probably one of the most unique songs on the album. It goes through so many directions, and it has probably one of the most ugly sounds I've ever heard in a rock song. So the fact that they titled it Super Pop is really self-aware. It's cool, because it's probably like the least pop song ever. And that's one thing I gotta highlight, is at no point does this album really feel redundant. There's so many good riffs on here. Like you could tell Logan Mader and Blunt were just having a blast putting this together, because it just never stops. Like there's so many amazing riffs on this album, to the extent that it makes me want to relearn guitar. It makes me want to commit to learning guitar, because I can't believe someone could even make these sounds with just an instrument. The title track is one of the coolest songs I have ever heard, and it is one of the best examples of everything I just said. This song fits so many riffs into one song that it just makes me excited to see where it's going to go next. I think the only really big single off this album, or really the only single off this album, was Inside. It's not hard to see why. It's definitely the most accessible song. It's probably the catchiest. It doesn't feature a bridge, but rather an outro into an instrumental interlude, which I'll discuss shortly. It's solid. I really love this track. I think it's one of the better nu metal songs to come out from this era. It's so unfortunate that it's as slept on as it is, because it's good. It's just great rock music, and it's a shame that more people don't know about it. And Inside is also a good conclusion to Prince Valium, because it's one of the more optimistic songs on the album. It's one of the more hopeful tracks. In regards to what I was saying earlier about the theme of time and age being very prevalent throughout the entirety of Prince Valium, Inside kind of reminds you you're not as old as you think you are.
You're old.
It reminds you that there's still a lot to look forward to. Some of the best moments of your life you have yet to discover. You're never going to discover those moments if you just feel sorry for yourself. You need to basically tie your boots, look forward, and just hit life with as much gusto as you can. It's a great song. It's one of my favorite songs to work out to. It's a very interesting song because initially you can't say this is one of the more generic songs on the album, as it's really just a verse and chorus, and there's no bridge. It just kind of ends after that. What makes it interesting is its instrumental outro. What's cool about this outro is it's like an electronic jam session between the members of Medication. So much so that it reminds me a lot of what Joe Hahn would do in Linkin Park. It has this very like retro vibe to it that feels like something straight out of a video game. Like something that was made by a bunch of nerds. And I don't mean that in an offensive way. Like I mean that it just sounds cool. Like it's really, really neat. And it reminds me of some of the better moments Linkin Park was doing a couple years before this album came out. And what's cool about Inside is it's basically the rebuttal to an earlier song on the album, like No Direction, which is about basically feeling hopeless and not really having a lot of places to go. The solos on this album are phenomenal. Logan Mader is one of the best guitarists of his era. And like I said, I can't believe this is my first introduction to him. Like, I really, really want to explore the rest of his discography. And I'm really happy to see that he's making music again with Once Human. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if later down the line, I'm going to do a video on that band. Kyle Sanders would go on to join Hell Yeah, who basically sucks ass. But at the same time, hey, he found something a little bit bigger than Medication. And that's something that I give him props for. Because, you know, making it in this business is really hard. And as much as I hate Hell Yeah, they're a pretty popular band. Josh Freese is always a household name. Wherever someone needs a solid drummer, he usually gets hit up. And Whitfield Crane, after this, he would go on to do Another Animal, who also failed. Another band that completely flopped. Now, it just sucks, dude. Like, the man has terrible luck with bands. I know he brought Ugly Kid Joe back together, and I guess depending on how well these videos do, I'll probably do a series of videos on listening to Ugly Kid Joe for the first time to see how I resonate with them. That's all this album is it's just a bunch of different guys coming together and finding synergy and chemistry with each other. Being that the last time I was talking about an album was that stupid Godsmack album, When Legends Rise, that's something that we really gotta appreciate. Especially in the case of Medication, because they're a supergroup. You have Whitfield Crane, who came from pretty much two alternative metal bands. You have Logan Mader, who came from a pretty extreme band, a very heavy band, definitely something much stronger than what the radio was playing at the time. You have Kyle Sanders and Blunt, who were in pretty obscure bands before this, but hey, that's good too, because that gives them the energy and the drive to really prove something on this album, which they absolutely did. Like, Blunt and Logan Mader are two of my favorite guitar duos ever. I would say they have the same chemistry someone like Brian Head Welch does with James Monkey Schaefer, but in a way that's more compelling, more interesting, as the songwriting on here on this album takes a lot more creative risks than some of the stuff Korn has done since 2002. And lastly, it can't be understated how wonderful of a frontman and lyricist Whitfield Crane is. Like, it's truly a shame that nobody really knows about this album because it's fantastic. So to extrapolate on how unknown this album is, you can't even buy it on iTunes. You can't find it on Apple Music. It's not on Spotify. It's as rare as it gets, man. Like, this is even more rare than that Another Animal record. I had to spend close to $40 just buying it off of Amazon. So, you know, get it while you can. I think you could still buy it off of eBay, but who knows how long that's going to go on for. As I understand it, Medication broke up because they lost funding as their record label went bankrupt or something like that. Which is interesting because it's just like with Another Animal, where these guys didn't break up because of drug addictions or because they hated each other, but because they just, you know, they weren't seeing a return. They weren't, you know, the band was costing more money to be in than it was to actually produce or to make a living off of. That's truly a shame that that has happened twice in Whitfield Crane's career, because much like that Another Animal record, this is a great album, and it's one of the best albums of its scene. I would go so far as to say Medication is the most underrated new metal band of all time. Maybe even the most underrated supergroup of the 2000s. Because hell, even Army of Anyone got, you know, they sold. They didn't sell as much as they needed to, but they sold some records. Dark New Day, they had some hits also. I would even say Another Animal is more famous than Medication. Barely, but even so. Like I said, it is pretty hard to find. I would suggest you buy it if you can, but don't spend close to $40 on it like I did. Like, if it's at that level, then just don't do it. Unless you really want to. But I mean, I wanted to because I love this album. But if you're checking this out just based on my suggestions alone, I would never tell someone to spend $40 on an album that they're really taking a leap of faith on. Like I said, it is hard to find. I'm pretty sure you could still find it on YouTube like I did. And I've considered uploading it to Rock Guy Radio to preserve it in some way, shape, or form. Even if we did get like cucked by copyright, I don't think that would happen. But even so, like, this record does deserve to be kept alive. Now, if you have time right now, just hit it up on YouTube this moment. Start from track 1 and listen to a track a day, or listen to it all at once. And either way, I think you'll really get a lot out of this album, and hopefully it impacts you in the same way it did to me. So, second album review of 2022. Are you familiar with Medication? Have you ever heard of them before? Are they a band that really means something to you? Or is this your first exposure to Medication? Is this the first time you've ever heard of this band? If so, Either way, tell me what you think of medication, how they resonate with you, or if they resonate at all. And yeah, check it out, spread the word, because this is a great album. It's a slept on album. And as I said before, depending on how well these 2 medication videos do, maybe I'll upload the album to my channel, because like I said, it's something that deserves to be preserved and remembered. So thanks for watching. As always, be calm, be cool, collected, and we'll see you later.